All right, time to hit the books and do a little deep dive.
Sounds good to me.
You sent over an executive order for us to unpack, signed just yesterday, January 24th, 2025. This one's already creating a buzz, about enforcing the Hyde Amendment.
Yeah, and I think what's really interesting here is, well, it's not like a brand new thing. It's more like they're really emphasizing this policy that's been around like forever.
Forever. How long are we talking?
Almost 5 decades.
5 decades. Wow. That's a long time for any policy to be around. So for those of us who might need a little refresher, what exactly is the Hyde Amendment?
Basically, it limits the use of federal funds for abortions, elective abortions.
Okay.
And, it's important to remember, this isn't banning abortion itself. It's just about how we pay for it.
Got it. So are we saying this new executive order is basically doubling down on that restriction?
Exactly. But to really get the full picture, you have to look at what it's replacing, right? Specifically, it revokes 2 older executive orders, numbers 14076 and 14079. Those were the ones that, may have made it easier to get abortion-related services if you relied on federal funding.
So it's like this back and forth, expanding, restricting.
Right.
Makes you wonder, what are the best arguments on both sides?
Well, let's start with the folks supporting this new order. One big thing they bring up is taxpayer dollars. I mean, imagine if you were completely against abortion. Would you want your taxes going towards something you see as, morally wrong?
It's a good question. It
Yeah.
gets into the whole idea of personal beliefs, right? And how those beliefs affect government spending. It's a big one.
Exactly. And then that leads into another point, If the federal government isn't paying for these abortions, well, where could that money go? Could it be used for other programs, other initiatives?
So it's like a budgetary reshuffling, guided by a specific set of values.
You got it. And there's also the argument that this executive order, it finally makes things clear because the Hyde Amendment's been around for so long, but how it was enforced, how people interpreted it, that's varied a lot. This order wants to make sure everyone's on the same page, applying this long-standing policy in a consistent way.
So for the folks who support it, it's about making sure this restriction, which they see as democratically agreed upon, is applied fairly and consistently.
Exactly.
Yeah, I'm following.
Now, we should flip the script and look at the counter-arguments. This is where things get complicated.
Well, I'm intrigued. Lay it on me.
One of the biggest worries is how it might impact access, to abortion services, especially for people relying on federal healthcare programs like Medicaid.
Yeah.
Think about folks who just can't afford private healthcare.
Right, yeah. That's a lot of people.
This raises some serious questions about, well, is healthcare really fair? Does this executive order basically mean if you're struggling financially, you have fewer choices when it comes to your health?
That's a huge question, right? It's like, does your income dictate your healthcare options? Seems pretty unfair if it does.
Yeah, it's a valid point. And it ties into this whole debate about women's rights, about bodily autonomy, right? This executive order, it feels like a step backward for a lot of people when it comes to reproductive rights, to being able to make your own decisions about your body without the government interfering.
So we're talking about some pretty big questions here. It's more than just a medical procedure. It's about individual freedom versus government control.
Absolutely.
Yeah. It's never that straightforward, is it?
Never. And even beyond the ethical stuff, there are, practical challenges. Critics are pointing out how difficult it'll be to actually change all the federal guidelines to fit this new order. That could lead to confusion for doctors, delays in getting services, and who knows, maybe even lawsuits.
So even if the intentions are clear, putting it into practice might be a mess. That definitely adds another layer of complexity, doesn't it?
For sure. And then you can't ignore how the public might react. We know abortion is already such a sensitive topic, and this executive order, well, it could make things even more divided, more tense between people with different opinions.
It makes you wonder if this just creates more of an us versus them situation.
It's a valid point.
Instead of, encouraging people to actually talk and try to understand each other.
Yeah, definitely a risk. And finally, there's the question of, well, what happens with international aid programs? What if this policy affects funding for global health initiatives, particularly those that include, abortion services as part of their reproductive health care work? The impact could go way beyond just the U.S.
So it's not just a domestic policy issue. It has ripple effects internationally.
Exactly. And it all comes back to this one really hard question. How do we balance these very strong personal beliefs with the needs of people who are, already vulnerable? And how do we, as a society, deal with issues that are just so divisive?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is.
Okay, before we go too deep into the philosophy of it all, Can we take a step back and look at the history of the Hyde Amendment itself?
Sure.
I think to really understand what this executive order means, we need to understand where it came from.
Absolutely. Context is key. Let's rewind all the way back to 1976. Just 3 years after Roe v. Wade made abortion legal across the country.
Right.
That's when the Hyde Amendment first appeared. It started as a rider to the big funding bill for the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare.
A rider. So it wasn't a law on its own.
Nope. It was attached to this larger spending package. That approach, it's kind of become the Hyde Amendment's signature move. It has to be renewed every single year during the budget process, which, as you can imagine, has made it a major battleground between those who are pro-choice and those against abortion.
So every year, this political tug-of-war happens, showing how divided Americans are on this issue. It hasn't faded into the background at all.
Not at all. And while the main idea behind the Hyde Amendment, the whole restricting federal funding for abortions, that part's pretty much stayed the same. The exact words they use, how broad or narrow it is, that's shifted over time.
So it hasn't been this, static, unchanging policy.
Yeah, not at all.
It's been shaped by, the political climate and the changing social landscape.
Exactly. In its very first form, the Hyde Amendment was very strict. No federal money for abortions, except in cases of rape, incest, or if the mother's life was in danger.
So even in those early days, there were exceptions carved out.
Right. But even those exceptions, they caused arguments like, how do you define rape? How do you define incest? And how much danger did the mother have to be in for it to be considered a real threat to her life?
It sounds like every single word in this amendment has been, debated and analyzed endlessly.
Absolutely. And over the years, there have been a ton of attempts to either make those exceptions broader or narrower, depending on which political party was in control.
So it's been this back and forth for decades, with each side trying to, shift the lines a little bit within the rules in the amendment.
Precisely. And that brings us right back to this new executive order. By getting rid of the previous orders that might have loosened those restrictions, it signals a shift back to a stricter interpretation of the Hyde Amendment.
And like we talked about earlier, that raises some concerns about what it means for access to care, for reproductive rights in general.
Exactly. It shows us how even policies that have been around forever can be reinterpreted, can change, and those changes, well, they have real consequences for people's lives.
We've covered a lot of ground already, from the history of this amendment to what this executive order might mean, but this really feels like just the beginning, doesn't it?
Oh, definitely. We've set the stage. Now we need to dig deeper. What are the long-term implications? Will there be legal challenges? What ethical dilemmas does this order raise?
I'm ready to go deeper. Let's do it.
So, we got to talk about the legal fights that are probably coming because of this executive order. Something this big, it's bound to end up in court.
You mentioned those legal challenges before. Where do you see the biggest problems popping up?
I think a lot of it will come down to that constitutional right to privacy, the one that was so important in Roe v. Wade. People against this order will argue that it violates that right by making it harder to get an abortion.
So they'll basically say the government is overstepping, interfering with a woman's right to make her own medical choices.
Exactly. And it's interesting because even the Hyde Amendment itself has been challenged in court so many times over the years with different results, A lot of those lawsuits focused on whether the Hyde Amendment is unfair to low-income women because it might violate their equal protection rights.
So these legal fights over access to abortion, they've been going on for a while. It's not a new battlefield.
Nope, not at all. And beyond those constitutional arguments, there's a whole area of administrative law. This executive order tells federal agencies, hey, you need to change your rules to match this new policy. But those changes, they have to be done in a very specific way, following all the procedures.
So it's not as easy as just flipping a switch. There's a whole process they have to follow.
Right, and if they mess up, if they don't follow the rules, well, that could lead to even more legal trouble. Opponents could take them to court if they think the administration is overreaching or not doing things the right way. It could get really complicated and drag on forever with lawsuits happening all over the place.
So this executive order is basically starting a new chapter in the legal fight over abortion. Whatever happens with these court cases could have a huge impact on reproductive rights for a long time.
For sure. Okay, let's move away from the legal stuff for a minute. What about the ethical dilemmas this order brings up? One of the biggest worries I have is how it might affect people who are already struggling to get health care.
You're talking about how this might be especially hard on vulnerable populations.
Exactly. Think about it. If it's harder to get an abortion for people who rely on programs like Medicaid, that puts a bigger burden on low-income women, women of color, women in rural areas where healthcare is already hard to find. It makes you wonder, should your income decide what kind of healthcare you can get? It doesn't seem right.
It's like they're already facing so many obstacles, and now there's this extra hurdle. They have to deal with state-level restrictions and then worry about the financial barriers from the Hyde Amendment on top of that.
That's it exactly. And for many women, the choice isn't just should I have an abortion or not. It's can I even afford to get to a clinic? Can I afford to travel, take time off work, find someone to watch my kids? These things, they can affect a woman's whole life, her education, her job, everything.
It's a good reminder that access to healthcare is about way more than just medical procedures, right?
Yeah.
It affects economic opportunities, whether you can move up in life, your whole well-being.
Exactly. And this also brings up the issue of informed consent. If this executive order makes it harder to get certain types of healthcare information and counseling, well, how can a woman make a truly informed choice about her reproductive health?
So it's not just limiting access to the procedure itself, it's potentially limiting access to knowledge, to unbiased advice.
That's right. It feels like the government is overreaching, maybe being paternalistic about healthcare decisions. It goes against the whole idea of individual autonomy.
Yeah, that people should be able to make their own choices about their bodies and their lives. So we're not just talking about legal and political battles here. We're talking about some really deep ethical questions about individual rights, social justice, and the role of government in personal health care.
You got it. And these aren't just theoretical debates. They have real consequences for real people.
Okay, let's change gears one more time and think about the political fallout from this executive order. We know abortion is such a divisive issue. How do you see this playing out? Oh, we're already seeing some pretty strong reactions from both sides. Feels like this is going to add fuel to the fire of these culture wars.
Absolutely. The people who support the order, they see it as a win. It's like their values are being represented, the promises made during campaigns are being kept. For them, it's about the sanctity of life and the government doing what they think it should be doing. It's likely to make their base really enthusiastic, and they'll probably put pressure on lawmakers to not just keep the order, but maybe even make it stricter.
And then on the other side, you have people who see this as a direct attack on women's rights, a step towards taking away reproductive freedoms. It's like a call to action for them to defend Roe v. Wade and fight back against what they see as the government overstepping its boundaries, interfering with personal health care decisions.
Exactly. We're already seeing protests happening because of this executive order, and I bet those will only get bigger as the legal and political battles heat up.
Yeah. It just reminds you that for a lot of people, this isn't just some policy debate. This is deeply personal, emotional. It's about their core values, their sense of control over their own bodies.
For sure. And that passion, it's going to fuel a lot of activism on both sides, probably making this one of the defining issues in upcoming elections and legislation.
So the impact of this could be way bigger than just this one executive order. It could really reshape the political landscape in some major ways. And again, it's not just about this one policy. It's about the whole fight for reproductive rights, about where the government should and shouldn't be involved in personal health care decisions.
It really highlights how even one policy decision can have these ripple effects that go way beyond the immediate situation.
It feels like we're heading into some choppy waters politically as this all plays out. It's going to take a lot of careful thought and a willingness to find some kind of common ground, even when there are such strong disagreements.
That's the challenge, right? But before we wrap up this part, let's zoom out a bit. We focused on the specifics of this executive order. But how does it fit into the bigger picture of what's going on in society? What are some of the broader concerns?
That's a great point. It's like, don't miss the forest for the trees. What comes to mind for you?
Well, one thing that worries me is how this might damage people's trust in the government. When the government does things that seem really unfair or unjust to a lot of people, well, it can make them lose faith in the whole system.
So it's not just about this one policy. It's about the potential damage to how people participate in our democracy and whether they trust the government to work for them.
Exactly. If people feel like their voices aren't being heard or like the government doesn't care about them, they can become cynical and start participating. That's not good for any democracy.
It's dangerous when people start thinking the system is rigged against them.
Definitely. Another worry I have is, this could make our society even more divided, more prone to conflict. We've already talked about how polarized this issue is, and this executive order, well, it could make that even worse. It could lead to even more harsh language, more protests, maybe even violence.
Yeah, it's a good reminder of how important it is to have respectful conversations, to find ways to communicate even when we disagree strongly. It's the only way forward, really.
You're right. The bottom line is this executive order is about way more than just abortion. It brings up these fundamental questions about the role of government, how power is balanced, what kind of democracy we have, and the very fabric of our society.
And the answers we come up with, both individually and as a nation, will have a huge impact on the direction we go from here. So, as we move into the last part of our conversation, maybe we should shift our focus to figuring out what we can do. What are the potential paths forward?
Yeah, time to move from analyzing the problem to figuring out some solutions. Let's explore what we can do to navigate this situation and hopefully find a more productive way forward.
We've really spent a lot of time unpacking this executive order, trying to figure out what it means from all these different angles. And, well, it's complicated. There are no easy answers. So what do we do now? Where do we go from here?
You're right, no easy answers, but that doesn't mean we just give up and accept all this division.
Yeah, I agree. But what are the options? What can we actually do to move forward in a more positive way?
Well, I think one thing we really need is honest conversations,
Yeah.
real dialogue. We've talked about how polarized this issue is, but if we just shut down and stop talking, it's only going to make things worse, push people further apart.
That's true. But how do we even begin to have these conversations? When people have such completely opposite views on abortion, how can they actually listen to each other, let alone find some kind of common ground? It
Yeah.
feels almost impossible.
It's really tough, I agree. But maybe we can shift the focus a little. Instead of getting stuck on the procedure itself, maybe we can talk about shared values.
Shared values. Seriously. This is something that goes to the core of people's beliefs. How can there be shared values when the viewpoints are so different?
Think about it this way. Even the people with the most extreme views on abortion, they usually share some underlying values, like compassion, wanting things to be fair, wanting families and communities to be healthy.
So instead of arguing about the abortion procedure itself, maybe we can find common ground by focusing on the bigger picture, the things everyone wants to achieve.
Exactly. I think almost everyone, no matter what they think about abortion, would agree that we should try to prevent unwanted pregnancies.
That's a good point. Yeah, most people would agree on that. And if that's something we can agree on, then maybe we can work together. We could focus on things like making contraception more available, making sure sex education is comprehensive, and providing support for families.
Right. If we concentrate on those shared goals, we can start to build connections, create partnerships, and find solutions that actually benefit everybody. It might not make the disagreements go away, but it could make things more productive, less hostile.
It's like finding those areas where we can connect, those areas where we can work together to create a future where everyone feels supported and has the power to make the right choices for themselves.
That's the goal. But realistically, this executive order, it's probably going to lead to more lawsuits and political battles.
Yeah, that's already starting to happen.
Yeah.
So what can people who are worried about this executive order actually do? How can they make their voices heard and try to change things?
There are a few things they can do. One is to get involved in the political process, support the candidates who share their views, contact their elected officials, make sure those officials understand how this issue is affecting their lives and their communities.
So take that worry, that concern, and turn it into action. Make sure the people in power know what's going on.
Exactly. And another powerful thing to do is to support those organizations that are fighting to protect and expand access to reproductive health care. There are so many groups out there doing amazing work, providing services, legal help, advocacy, and education.
Yeah, donating your time or money to those organizations can make a real difference in their work, especially for the people most affected by this executive order.
Absolutely. And let's not forget about education and awareness. Just sharing accurate information about the Hyde Amendment, about this executive order, and what the consequences might be, that can help people understand the complexities and encourage them to get involved.
It's about cutting through all the noise and misinformation that surrounds this issue, helping people get the facts so they can form their own opinions, based on real information.
For sure. And lastly, I think it's important to remember how powerful personal stories can be. When people share their own experiences, how this policy affects them and their families, it makes the issue real. It's not just an abstract argument anymore.
Those stories are what really get to people, help them see past the political rhetoric and understand how these policies affect real lives.
It reminds everyone that policies aren't just words on paper, they have consequences for real people, in very real ways.
I think as we wrap up, it's really important to leave our listeners feeling hopeful, even with all the challenges we've talked about. It can feel overwhelming, but if you look at history, progress is possible.
I agree, definitely. Throughout history, we've seen how social movements can create positive change. They challenge unjust laws. They fight for more rights and freedoms. And those movements, they start with everyday people who say, enough is enough. We deserve better.
So to everyone listening, if this executive order has you feeling discouraged, please know you're not alone. There are so many people who share your concerns, and we can make a difference by working together.
This isn't the end of the story. It's just another chapter in this long and complicated fight for reproductive justice.
And as long as we keep talking about it, keep educating ourselves and each other, support those who are on the front lines, and hold on to hope, we can work towards a future where everyone has the freedom and the resources to make the right choices for their own lives.
It comes down to staying informed, staying involved, and never giving up on creating a more just and equitable world for everyone.
Well, thank you so much for taking us through this deep dive. This has been really eye-opening, to say the least.
It's been my pleasure. It's through these conversations, these explorations of difficult issues, that we can start to figure out a way forward.